Howdy, and welcome to the F1 Hatchet, and welcome to my summer series where I look at the teams and how they stack up against each other. As you know from my previous two videos, I had a bottom teams stack up video of the bottom four teams, and I've had a mid-tier stack up video of the mid four teams in the season. So if you haven't seen those, I would suggest that you go and see those so that you get an overall picture of the teams, at the mid-season mark. As of today, we'll just be talking about the top four teams. And just like last week, we have a team that is getting overlapped. So we have the comparison between the lower teams and the mid teams last week with that, Stake F1. And now we have RedBull with that mixture between last week's mid-tier teams and their top-tier teams. So you can get a big overall picture of how those teams are relating to each other all the way across the board. And of course, we see RedBull in that fourth position with an average starting position of 9 and an average finishing position of 9 with 3 DNFs. Now, if you look at that and you can look at the context of that, through the team members, and you can see that Max Verstappen is the main team member that's actually getting those results and getting them up to that fourth position. They have a chance, if Yuki Tsunoda can get to grips with that secondary Red Bull, that they will jump forward a little bit in this ranking if they can get both team members actually getting points on a regular basis. But we'll have to see if that comes about, or if that second seat is just too hard to judge and it's too much on a knife edge for Yuki Tsunoda to really get a grips on that or not. And we might have to wait till next season when the rules change to see if we can get a good, comparison between Yuki Tsunoda and Max at that point in time. And of course, we see here Mercedes in that third constructor's position in that nice light blue or aqua. And they're in that starting position of 7 and an average finishing position of 8 with 4 DNFs. So they're starting off a little bit better in those qualifying sessions and dropping back a little bit in those races, but they're, of course, ahead of the Red Bulls, both of those situations, and that kind of helps them bump up in those point standings more on a regular basis to push them up into that third position, even with 4 DNFs in that regard. So we'll have to see if Mercedes can keep those cars running in the second half with all of the engine updates that they've had so far. Will they start getting penalties for replacing those engine components? And are they going to be able to stay up there in the front running positions? Or will Red Bull be able to overtake them even with just Max Verstappen at the helm of that big team? And we see Ferrari in that second position with an average starting position of 7 and an average finishing position of 7 with just 2 DNFs. And so that gives them a little bit of edge on the Mercedes to get them up into that second position, finishing 1 position higher on average and only having 2 DNFs. So that helps them get that extra points when they need it above Mercedes. So that's a really good run for Ferrari, but they're nowhere close, as we can see, to the McLarens, who's in that first position and the average starting position of 3 and the average finishing position of 3 with only 1 DNF so far in this season. So they are really pretty much dominating this field this season, and we can see that in some of the graphs to come. And here we see the breakdowns of those 2 team members for each of these teams. So of course we see the Red Bulls in that blue, that dark blue across the board at the top. And we have the aqua or light blue for the Mercedes, the red for Ferrari, and of course the papaya or orange for the McLarens. And we see that, Yuki's in that 18th spot for the driver standings and has an average starting position of 14 and an average finishing position of 14 and has 1 DNF. And comparing that to his teammate, Max Verstappen, who starts off in the third position for the driver standings, has an average starting position of 3 and an average finishing position of 5. That makes him, well ahead of Yuki Tsunoda in getting these points. But again, if Yuki Tsunoda can actually get a grips on how to perform in that Red Bull, then we'll have to see how that plays out for the team itself in the future. But you compare the Red Bull team to the Mercedes teams, and you see that Kimi Antonelli, that rookie, is now in that 7th spot for the driver's standing and it has an average starting position of 10 and an average finishing position of 11 with 4 DNFs. So he's doing a pretty good job qualifying, getting up there into those points to start off with, but dropping back on average that one position. So he's kind of in that 11th spot. He has the majority or all of the DNFs in this case for Mercedes. So he's actually kind of hurting them in that regard. So he has 4 races that was not able to even get close to points on, as he had to drop out of the race. And so that kind of hurts Mercedes in that regard as well, not getting those, even though if there's a little bit of points here and there, they're not able to get those points, with that rookie. But he is actually came out strong, and so we'll have to see if he's going to finish the season strong. Now, if you compare him to George Russell, who starts off his average starting position in 4th, and his average finishing position is in 5th, and has 0, DNFs, that puts him in that driver's ranking of 4th. So he's actually doing a really good job qualifying up there right behind, of course, the McLarens and maybe, a Ferrari or Max Verstappen in cases in those races to start off the race with. But he's also dropping back just to that 5th position, but still getting good points for Mercedes and helping them maintain that constructor's standing that they're in. Now, you look at that and you compare it to the Ferraris, which they're really battling in this regard. And you see that Lewis Hamilton's in that 6th driver standing position, so a little bit farther back than George Russell, but his average starting position is in 8th, and his average finishing position is in 7th with 1 DNF. So even though Lewis is still trying to get the grips of that Ferrari, trying to get the most out of that, now he's been really down lately because of his driving on that Ferrari, but he's actually making up at least 1 spot between the qualifying and the finishing of the race. So that's good to see. So he's still moving in the direction. So if he can get a little bit more grips, get himself a little bit higher up in that qualifying session, he might be able to help out his teammate in the Ferraris, push and maintain that 2nd position overall and keep Mercedes behind them. We have Charles Leclerc within that 5th standing position for the driver's standings, so just ahead of his teammate. But he has an average starting position of 5 and an average finishing position of 6. So he's a little bit ahead of his teammate, getting really good points. Still dropping back a little bit during the race, so not be able to really maintain that qualifying position and dropping back. So if they can figure out how to, get that driving ability out of that Ferrari in these races, they'll have a little bit better spots on getting more and optimizing those points for Ferrari. And then, of course, we come to the big winners here, the McLaren. So we have Lando Norris in that 2nd position, just behind his teammate, with an average starting position of 3 and an average finishing position of 3 with 1 DNF. And you compare that to Oscar Piastri, who has an average starting position of 2 and an average finishing position of 2. So he's really up there, almost at the very front every time on average for Oscar Piastri, with Lando Norris right behind him on those qualifying sessions and the race session. So, McLaren's looking really strong. And of course, as it's looking right now, Oscar has the edge over Lando for the Drivers' Championship, but we'll have to see how things play out, especially since Lando's already had 1 DNF. So if something happens to Oscar, that may throw things Lando's way in this second half of the season. So we come back and look at Red Bull as they look at the team members and how they compare to each other. And we can see Liam Lawson here in those first 2 races. And we pick up with Yuki Tsunoda in that aqua, kind of far behind Max Verstappen in that dark blue. And of course, we're looking at the finishing positions on the y-axis. So the lower we go down to that 0 marker, the better, considering that that's what they want is to finish the race in that 1st position over these races. So those trend lines are going up, which is not as good sign. That's kind of showing that they're getting farther back as the season has progressed. And so we'll have to see if that can change through the second half of the season, if they bring any updates, but it doesn't sound like they are bringing a lot of updates as they're focusing more on next year's race car and all the rules changes that go along with that. So we'll have to see if Max Verstappen can, get back in grips with that Red Bull, and to see if Yuki Tsunoda can, get an edge on that Red Bull, be able to get closer to his teammate in these last races for the season, to see if he can come closer and get more points for Red Bull to push them up in potential, covering over the Mercedes and possibly the Ferraris as well. But most likely they will probably stay in that position that they're currently in. Of course, as we move over to Mercedes, we can see Kimi Antonelli in that blue and George Russell in that light blue or aqua. And you can kind of really tell off the bat how that rookie is handling that Mercedes and kind of going through this season. He started off really strong, getting really close to his teammate, but as the season has progressed, he's kind of gotten farther away from his teammate on average. And you can see that through that trend line going farther up, has a higher steep slope on that trend line, so it's getting worse throughout the season. So he has a little bit to do to really come back to grips and know how to handle that Mercedes, as that's gotten tweaked with those little updates throughout the season to try to get them more competitive. Now we can kind of see George Russell a lot more stable, a lot more consistent in that Mercedes. Yes, he's had a couple offs here and there, but most likely really being consistent in that Mercedes, closer to that, 5th place marker overall, even though he is getting worse slightly throughout the season as all the other teams have put more updates and more things into that car to, get them the edge over the Mercedes as we're going through this. Mercedes really doesn't understand that car from what I can tell. They really put some updates in it and shine at certain points, and then other points that kind of lag behind and they don't understand why they're lagging behind. So we'll have to see if they can get the grips and understand what is going on with that Mercedes this season, or if they just scrap it, in general and focus on next year's car to see if they can just put that extra edge on next year's car instead of trying to figure out this year's regulations. Now we see the Ferraris, and this is what I really like to see in this regard, as these two top tier drivers in this Ferrari. So you can see Lewis Hamilton in yellow and Charles Leclerc in red, and how much they parallel each other in this season, having good days and bad days kind of along each side of each other. And of course, Lewis Hamilton's still trying to get a grips on that Ferrari, so he's lagging a little bit behind his teammate Charles Leclerc, but you can see pretty much where that Ferrari resides and how it likes each track versus other tracks, because we can see more of a parallel as those drivers perform, and we don't get the one-offs, a lot of back and forth in these graphs, as we've seen some of the other teams in that regard, because they're trying to have the better feel for these cars. And so I think that top tier teams kind of have a better format, understanding of how those get out of these cars. And so it's more up to the drivers in that circumstances when you're comparing teammates. And so you can kind of look at these and get a better idea of how those teammates are handling these races, each race at a time. And of course, Lewis Hamilton coming in this season, still trying to get a grips on that Ferrari, as I said earlier. So we still have to give him a little bit of slack, but we can kind of get a better picture of how those teammates compare to each other. And of course, we see the same thing a lot more with McLaren as well. But what's interesting here is we see that, Lando in that red started off really well this season, kind of edging out his teammate Oscar in the very beginning. But then Oscar came back, in those next 3 or 4 races after that opening stint, and it's kind of dominated that little bit of section there and put him in the edge. And then, of course, you have, Lando coming back here and there, but is still falling behind slightly on his teammate. But you can see those true trend lines. Orlando's getting worse throughout the season, just slightly, and you see Oscar getting better throughout the season, just slightly. Not a big curve, but just enough to put some extra pressure on each driver and how they play out in the season. So you can kind of figure out potentially where they're going to end up at the end of the season if things stay the same. So it looks like here, as I said earlier, that Oscar has the edge and is going to win out in the Drivers' Championship. But of course, we have that one off that Lando had in Canada, which kind of skews things slightly there. So if Oscar has a bad race and gets knocked off, and if the DNF for some reason, then we'll have to see how that plays out overall and see if Lando can really scrape back and get back in the lead and push some more pressure on his teammate Oscar for the finishing and get that number 1 driver standing that he wants so bad. And here we see, of course, the bar graph of where they got points for each team as we go throughout the season. So the more points, the higher that bar goes up. And we kind of look at this, and so you can see right in front of your face that McLaren over the whole season is getting points every single week and getting lots of points every single week, and pretty much ahead of all the other teams. And you can see that, through that bar graph and that trend line going up, saying that they're still getting better throughout the season. They started off comparatively, to the other teams, but as that season progresses, they're just keeping that pressure on and getting that much better overall. So they're getting farther and farther ahead of the other teams around them. Now we can see Ferrari and Red, who started off fairly poorly, and it's starting to come back through this season and getting back up into that second position with that trend line a little bit steeper on that incline, so that you can actually get that much better, faster, in this season. But they're still so far behind that it's going to be hard for them to be anywhere close to the McLarens at the end of the season, where we see Mercedes and Red Bull having that decrease on that trend line. So they're getting worse throughout the season. So they're getting less and less points as the season has progressed. But of course, we still see Mercedes with that nice bright light blue, doing some fairly well runs in these point runs, especially like in Canada, getting up there into that, really high 40s. So that makes it a little bit of effort there, where Red Bull is constantly in there, but they're starting to slack a little bit as the season has progressed. And again, here's the same data, just in a step graph, added it up throughout the season, so we can kind of see where they are and see what the big gaps are between each team a little bit more clear. And you can see, that nice papaya or orange color with McLaren just getting streaming up with that big giant gap between them and that second place team of Ferrari in that red. Now red, as you start to see this graph, they started off fairly poorly. So when they started off in that fourth position at the beginning of the season, but started gaining ground and started taking over that, third and second position as the season has progressed. But there's still a good fight between them and Mercedes. So we'll have to see how each of those teams can handle the pressure and what kind of updates they're going to bring to this car throughout the second half of the season, or how things will end up if they start focusing on next year's car, start putting more of the effort and money in that direction to see if they can still get the grips with each other in this season. Now, of course, I have Red Bull in there with blue, so they started off in that third position, but have fallen back into that fourth position. But they still have a chance to pull back up into even that second position if they get their cards right and start pulling, their weight, especially with the two members in that Red Bull. Like if Yuki starts scoring lots of points in the second half of the season alongside Max, that will help them dramatically. So if you found this interesting or helpful at all, I would appreciate a like and a subscribe. As next week we are in Zandvoort, and I'll have a post-race reaction on that race, kind of telling you my feelings on how each driver went in that race and anything that happened to those drivers as well. And of course, it's going to be next weekend on August 31st. And it has a length of 2.646 miles with 72 laps being run for a total race distance of 190.504 miles. It was first introduced in 1952, and the lap record holder currently is Lewis Hamilton from 2021 with 1 minute 11.097 seconds. So until then, I will see you on the grid, and farewell.